Hello and welcome. It is Monday, the 22nd day of November 2021. It's 10 o'clock. It is a hot 80 degrees and 30 mile per hour winds here in Ventura. So there is a fire warning for California. So wherever you are, be careful this holiday season. You know, the interesting thing about our hobby is that when we run out of things to talk about, we recycle previous things to talk about. Usually controversial things like, ooh, I'm a better player than you are, or if you don't play 5th edition, you're a bad person, or racism. And then we also recycle other topics, like, what's your favorite game? So that's the topic that has been recycled recently. There's been a lot of talk revisiting favorite games and favorite systems that aren't 5th edition and why. And I've already done 2 vlogs on this, but now I'm going to get a little bit more personal as to which ones I think are great games and why. These are the games that I absolutely love or have had some part in the creation. So if you're very familiar with my vlogs and my history, the first video game should not come as any surprise to you. It's FASERIP Marvel, the superhero role-playing game, the very first Marvel superhero role-playing game that was produced by TSR way back in the old days of the late 80s. FASERIP was a percentile-based system. I consider it one of, if not the best superhero role-playing game ever made. I have talked about it on multiple vlogs, and I'm sure I will again, and in multiple conversations about what I think the best game is. And the top of my list is always this game. And there's a couple reasons why I think this is one of the best role-playing games, but definitely one of the best superhero role-playing games. And is because it uses words instead of numbers for task resolution. So it's a percentile-based system, and so you could have like 76% in your energy blast, 25% in your strength or whatever. But there are corresponding words to each of those ranks in relation to comic book sounding words like Hulk-like, exceptional, amazing, unearthly. So instead of having a 72 energy blast, you have an unearthly energy blast. You avoid the numbers altogether. The DM is the only one who has to worry about the numbers. When combat or any other situation resolves, you just tell him which one you're using. And you say, I'm blasting him in the face with my unearthly energy blast, and I roll this. And the DM resolves everything else. That is just amazing. I'm not aware of any other game that has ever used words instead of numbers to describe your rating with a power or a stat. Instead of that 18 strength, you have a Spider-Man-like strength. You have a Hulk-like strength. And that just totally switches the gears of the game. And I have talked so many times why I think that's so important, especially growing up, learning disabled and having trouble with numbers, and finally finding a game that didn't use numbers, that just let me to use words, and how those words just corresponded with my imagination and how it worked for me. So there are separate vlogs I've done about FASERIP Marvel, and I'm sure I will do them again, but that's the top of my list of games I absolutely love. Number 2 of my list is Villains and Vigilantes, most specifically Villains and Vigilantes 2nd Edition. That game took up 85% of my gaming life. Most of my high school years and a large percentage of my college years was playing Villains and Vigilantes and not Dungeons and Dragons. And it's a random superpower generation system, which I absolutely love because you can get some ridiculous random characters. It's got this weird rule where your first character is you. So you're playing yourself as your very first character. Of course, if you picked up the game when I picked it up, that means you're playing a 12-year-old with superpowers. So that's sort of weird when you think about it now. But back then it seemed awesome. You know, Teen Titans, Robin, a bunch of 12-year-olds saving the world. Me as a superhero, the version of me I wanted to be instead of the version of me I was at the time. It's a really cool concept, and it's a really interesting system. It does have some major flaws in that it's heavily biased towards high agility characters. The higher your agility, the higher your speed, the more things you can do. But the random power system is fun, and it's one of the few systems that lets you play a Superman character and a Batman character, and both of them have things to do, and neither of them feel like they outclass the other one. Everybody sort of is on the same page, the same power level, no matter what type of character you are, and they all contribute. The third game I absolutely love, of course, is Heroes Unlimited from Palladium. The beautiful disaster, as I refer to it. This is a game that could have been amazing. It has such amazing ideas, but it is written and edited and presented in such a poor fashion that it just falls short of how awesome it could be. But I love everything about this game. I just can't stand the way the game's presented. The system is chunky and hard to wrap your brain around, even though it's a simple D20 system. The superpowers are possibly the best superpower descriptions I've ever seen in a superhero role-playing game. In fact, as I've said millions of times, even if I'm running other games that use superpowers, I will crib the descriptions of the powers from Heroes Unlimited and translate them over to whatever game I'm running, because it gives such a good description of what a power can and cannot do. I mean, for every time you have those questions like, can I blow up that car with my heat vision? There's the questions, it's happened. Can I cook my dinner using my heat vision? And Heroes Unlimited actually gives you tables and charts and research to how much flame your body can generate, how much that equals to in the level of Celsius and heat, and how much of your energy blast you would have to use to actually blow up a car or cook your dinner. Another one I want to recommend is an extremely obscure game called Ravenstar. Ravenstar is basically Shadowrun in space. It was a very obscure, limited print game. It was at the time considered one of the best, if not the best, role-playing game on the market. That was 1989, 1990. It received tons of good press. I had a copy, and it is a great game. It's incredibly well written. It's an interesting space system. It's a great dice system. It's Shadowrun fixed, set in outer space, and it was great. But it's impossible to find a copy. Then, of course, we have Blue Planet. Blue Planet is one of the games I absolutely fell in love with because I loved the art. I loved the idea. I loved how it just sort of took you away to a truly alien world. It was basically Waterworld, the role-playing game. The idea was you were colonizing a planet that was mostly water, and you had to develop, your characters and adventure in this world where 90% of the world was covered with water and all the things like weird, super hyper intelligent water beasts. But it was this amazing beauty about the planet and the game and the system. Unfortunately, it never was around for a very long time. It has been re-released. And there was just something about it that captured my imagination and heart in the way that some games, others. I mean, there's games I absolutely love, but there's just certain games that even if you never play them, capture your heart. And speaking of that, of course, we come to my current favorite game, possibly my favorite game of the decade, Tales from the Loop and the Year Zero system. I absolutely love Tales from the Loop. I fell in love with the Tales from the Loop from the very first time I saw the art without even knowing where the art came from. It just was this beautiful, melancholy image of a childhood that never was but should have been. The idea of that last summer as a kid before you go off to high school and all the adventures we had in the 80s. And it was, of all the retro 80s nostalgia, this one just captured the most. There was just this amazing wistfulness, longing about the art. No matter how ridiculous the art was, if it was a giant decaying robot with a kid facing the decaying robot and the images of the night. And of course, the artist is basing it on his childhood in Sweden, and that just sort of those long Swedish winters and the idea of those short, amazing summers that you would have in that land before that bleak, oppressive snow just hits again, and what it was like growing up in the 80s then, but then using your imagination to imagine what's prowling in those forests, what's prowling across that desolate landscape. Could it be dinosaurs? Could it be some nefarious technology? There's just a wistful, longing, beautiful melancholy, and for me it just hit me in the heart, and my love of things like the open road, the open desert, Route 66, that nostalgia, that idea of the future that never was, that gleaming neon sign flickering in the dark after a long road trip. Someday I'll tell you my long road trip, Route 66, Tales from the Loop story, and why it just sings to my imagination. Even though I've never played it, I've never run it, I can't find anybody that wants to play it because the idea just is like, kids? Why would I want to play a kid? But it's just like, dude, Stranger Things. This is the Stranger Things role-playing game. The system is simple. It's elegant. It's just captures that nostalgia. It's the 80s that we should have been instead of the 80s that was. Another game that I absolutely love is a very little-known system called Atomic Highway. It's an exploding D6 system similar to the West End Games D6 system, but it's slightly different. It's a system that I love so much that I actually took it apart and rewrote it to create my own D6 role-playing game that maybe I'll publish some day. It's basically more of a Mad Max future than a Gamma World future, though there are rules for doing the Gamma World for itself. It's if you want to do a Gamma World type setting with mutations, it is, but it's more of that Mad Max, just cars driving across the desert, that quests for survival, that 1980s post-Holocaust that we saw every Saturday in the movies, the desert, the one lone town, that combination of nuclear Holocaust and Old West. And then it brings it to another game that captured my imagination for a long time, and that was Cyberpunk 2020. I love Cyberpunk 2020 so much that I actually wrote for Artisolian Games for a while, helped create and write the Cypergeneration role-playing game, helped work and create and write the Fusion system, did a lot of stuff for Artisolian, love Cyberpunk 2020. Love the art, the life path, the idea, just that, that Blade Runner future. Yeah. Then, of course, we have games I love because I worked on them. And we'll save those for last. Then another game that I absolutely love that nobody's probably ever heard of was called Villains Never Win. It was a very obscure superhero role-playing game that used playing cards instead of dice. It had a very interesting premise where you either could play the villains or you could play the heroes combating the villains, but you understood that the basic concept was just like in the comic books, no matter how well the villains pull off their plan, they're eventually gonna fail. And it was just a really fun game that I only got to play 2 or 3 times, but I absolutely loved it. And then that brings us to Pathfinder, the game that stole our heart, kicked 3.5 and 4th edition to the curb, and took up my gaming life for 5, 6, 7 years. Pathfinder at first was everything I wanted Dungeons & Dragons to be after looking at 4th. Of course, I'm one of the few people who actually like 4th edition, but I just had so much fun playing it, so much fun running it. It was such a great system. Sure, it was chunky and clunky and got more chunky and more clunky to the point where I got sick of it because it was just like, I'm 3rd level and I have plus 88. But at the beginning, when Pathfinder first came out and so many people jumped to it, it was like the glory days of D&D all over again. It was just a bunch of people playing Pathfinder. It was kind of like when GURPS first came out. It's a bunch of people who just abandoned everything else and jumped on that bandwagon and absolutely loved it for a while and just had great times, but then it became weird. And speaking of GURPS, of course, we have to mention the games I love because I worked on them and helped create them. And that, of course, is GURPS IST, GURPS Supers, GURPS Time Travel, GURPS Black Ops, GURPS Martial Arts, GURPS Cyberpunk, GURPS Fantasy, GURPS Horror, and GURPS Horse Clans. Vampire Horse for the win. In fact, there might have been another GURPS product I worked on, but I don't remember all of them. I think Time Travel and Martial Arts was the one I contributed the most to. Supers and IST were the ones I contributed the second most to. I play tested and wrote a bunch of stuff for GURPS. Like many people, when GURPS first came out, I jumped on that GURPS bandwagon and just embraced GURPS and converted everything to GURPS. And everything I was running was GURPS. Everything I was playing was GURPS. Everybody gave up every game that they were running and playing and converted it to GURPS. It was just the idea that, hey, I could actually now finally play the character I wanted to play. And it was such a simple system. But like most point-based systems, once the Splat books started coming out, it just became a mathematical slog. And then sort of the fun lost. But since I helped, create so much of GURPS, I feel like I have to put it on there. And speaking of games I also helped create, of course, we have to mention Fusion. which led to the Silhouette system, which led to Heavy Gear. Those are all games that I had some say in their creation. I mean, definitely Fusion. I was there when the Fusion system first got started. Champions of the New Millennium, Fusion's Dragon Ball, Fusion's Cyberpunk, Fusion's Magic. I wrote the Fusion Psionic system and the Fusion Superpowers systems. Sadly, Fusion never went anywhere because it was overly complicated when it didn't need to be, but it was a part of my life for about a year. And it had potential. It was just, yeah. And of course, Cypergeneration is another game that I helped create for Artisolian. I don't know if my name is still in it, but it was. I did a lot of work and playtesting and writing and creating Cybergeneration, so of course it has to list on my list of favorite games. But if I was going to recommend any of those games to you, if you want to play a superhero role-playing game, you can't go wrong with Marvel. Unfortunately, it's really hard to find that game because it's out of print. But thankfully, there are some retro clones available. One's called G-Core, the other one's called 4H, and the third one is surprisingly called FASERIP. And we have the new Marvel superhero game coming out to be starting to be playtested next year. You can pre-order it on Amazon for $9, and that might recapture the magic of the FASERIP Marvel system. Sadly, all the superhero role-playing games that I would recommend to you are out of print. Now, if there's a fantasy game that I would recommend to you, you notice there's very few fantasy games on here because, most of my fantasy life has been D20 Fantasy. So yeah, if you're a fantasy fan and don't really like 5th edition, I would suggest exploring the OSR. If you want a game that sort of captures that retro 80s nostalgia, I highly recommend Tales from the Loop. I can't, and the D6 Year Zero system that makes up Tales from the Loop. Everything Free League does is just breathtakingly amazing. That's a reason why they've won so many awards. So there you go. There's the list of games I like and recommend and why I like and recommend them. And some of them we will talk about again. I'm sure I'll talk about Marvel again, Heroes Unlimited again, Tales from the Loop again. And of course, any chance I get to mention the fact that, hey, yeah, I wrote that GURPS product. Of course, I'm not going to pass it up. All these games can be found or ordered at your friendly local game store. That's Cess Games Anime here in Ventura. Some of them might be harder to find because they're out of print and you might have to go onto eBay. But all of them are, at least most of them, have drive-through RPG downloads available and legacy files, and several of them have been reconverted to OSR games. I wish somebody would OSR the fuck out of Heroes Unlimited so it's actually playable, because so much potential. It falls so short, but it's just such a beautiful disaster. If you appreciate this list and want to hear more stuff like this, let me know. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. Help me hit 1,000 subs. If you're feeling generous with the holidays coming up, consider supporting me through the various ways you can support me. And above all, happy holidays, stay safe, and start cooking that turkey. Yum, yum, yum.